Hey everyone, it's Adrienne Lopez here, the Integrative Healing Coach, and welcome to the Lifting the Veil podcast. And I'm so glad if you are here for your first time that you've stopped by to take a listen. You're very welcome here. And for those of you returning listeners, thank you so much for coming back and joining me this afternoon or whenever you're listening to this podcast. This week I wanted to talk to you about the joy of being. And it sounds kind of simple, the joy of being, but in our culture, a lot of times, unconsciously, we've been given the message that we have to do something to earn joy. And so I wanted to talk and unpack this topic a little bit more in regards to a veil, right? This is called lifting the veil to joy, things that get in the way. And so last week I had made a post called a love affair with frequency. So this is kind of an extension of that message that I shared around the energetic imprints that we've learned to identify. And really the energetic imprints are ways of organizing life energy in our bodies, the sensations, the emotions, and then the narrative that goes with that, and how that got put in place, and how that becomes, on one degree or another, a love affair. And I say love affair in regards to that it's familiar. It's a familiar sense of self that brings a sense of continuity in a world where there may not have been a lot of that as children, as we were putting our identity into place. So I want to extend this topic a little bit more because it's so much more than like what now? Like once we identify that, many of the automatic responses or ways of identifying with the world or using our energy in the world isn't necessarily by choice, but often a product of trying to survive, trying to make sense of the world as young, developing children with these nervous systems that are trying to find out the rules and how to belong and how to connect and how to get our needs met and how to feel loved. And so life is so much more than this. And when we get an invitation either through some traumatic or catastrophic events in our life, or we actually come to the point where we start noticing that a lot of the structures in our life, the ways of being that we've had in our life may not be our highest joy or expression. So this is where I come to the topic of the joy of being. And where is that for you? Where is that for me? And that's my inquiry right now as I begin to really dive into the somatic sensing work that I've been doing for over a year now. And I held my third in-person circle here last night in this space. And it was just so magical and so powerful. It really lights me up. It's really my passion, and it brings me joy to see people received in their own innocence and their own goodness that they may have not received as children, and got those programs that something was wrong, who we are isn't good enough, or it's not right, and then becoming on this treadmill of attempting to quote unquote get it right, and how that can be so maddening because it loses the essence of the joy of creativity and fun and play and living our life for the pure experience of who we are. So I always come back to the yogic philosophy foundations because I think a lot of the concepts that they articulated through the lens of yoga, we're actually, from a certain cultural historical standpoint, in that way, you could consider them limited. But the reason why I so value them is because they're timeless. Like many wisdom traditions, yoga isn't necessarily a religion. It's more of a way of accessing, harnessing your life energy, being aware of how you use your bioenergy, and that it's a thing, and that it's really co-creative. So it brings me to the idea of Sat-chit-ananda. And that's been roughly translated as being, like being, sat, truth, chit, and ananda, bliss. So the bliss of knowing the truth of who you are, or the joy of knowing your true being. And I've mostly been interested in the chit part, which translates in some schools of thought to the mind heart. So when the mind rests in the heart, and it's even more than that, right? It's not just the mind resting in the heart. It's that there's a certain relationship where the mind serves the heart. And I'm not talking in a romantic sense. I'm talking about in knowing or gnosis. Like the mind serves the knowing of the heart. And the knowing of the heart is vibrational. It is intuitive. And this is where our true nature begins to truly flourish. Because the joy of being is our birthright. And if we don't intentionally begin to choose that for ourselves, begin to claim that for ourselves, declare that for ourselves, then it's not something that we may experience consistently or to the level that's available when we begin to receive our nature. So why is it, if joy is our birthright, that so many people are suffering? And what's that about? And what can we do? Is there anything we can do about this state of suffering? So suffering is often related to being unable to access joy. The Yoga Sutras describe this condition as avidya, which literally translates into the idea of ignorance. But it's actually a little bit more subtle than that. It means incorrect or incomplete knowledge of one's own nature. And so, in another way, we could say that it's ignoring the true nature of ourself. And so how does joy, or the lack of experience of joy, which is suffering, connected to ignoring the true nature of ourselves? And how can we know the world more authentically? How can we know ourselves authentically when we don't even know our own nature? And for a lot of people who might be hearing this, if I was walking down the street and I stopped someone and I said, well, you don't really know your true nature, they might get really upset and say, what are you talking about? Of course I know who I am and I know my own nature. And I get that. And I want to share like a little analogy that comes up. And you may have experienced this as a long-time meditator and also an artist. I've spent a lot of time in silence. I mean, my mouth is silent. That doesn't mean my mind isn't is silent, let's say. And so part of meditating is begin to observe the narration in your mind that we've become identified with, that we think is us. And after sitting in silence for some time, sometimes years, you begin to see the true nature of this narrator in your head. And I can speak from my own experience because I don't want to project this on anyone else. But there's this commonality of people's experience as they meditate. It might show up in different ways, come through different portals. So I don't mean to generalize. But my experience is that I began to see through sitting with my own mind, with acceptance, with love, with compassion, to really listen, not to what it was saying, not what my mind is saying, but the intent or the unspoken intent behind this narration. What is the objective? What is it trying to do? What is it trying to accomplish through the constant chitter-chatter? And it's a process of falling in love with the fullness of who I am. It's the process of noticing my mind's commitment, whether it's conscious or unconscious, to protect this organism that has been named as me, a certain world view that gave me a sense of continuity, a sense of stability, a sense that I could count on something, even if it was painful, even if it wasn't what I really wanted. And all of that, attached to that, we could go on in many levels. And so as a meditator, you begin to observe the object of one's own personality. There's this superficial observation. And then there's something that happens when you begin to sit and sit and sink and sit and sink. You begin to go under the noise. And I don't mean to say that the mind is simply noise, but it's a certain frequency of being that is mental. And it's like walking into a room which is you, which is myself, and there's an object in the middle, and it's the conceptual mind and all of its productions, all of its creations. And in that way, it is kind of like an artist, because it took material, it took situations, it took emotions, and it made something out of it. And so as an artist, if you've ever done art or you've ever seen artists at work, or you've ever made something that took dedication, focus, diligence, but there's something specific about art, and more specifically drawing objects out into the world that you see out in the world. So you may have had a similar experience, or you can imagine having such an experience. But when you go to draw an object, you have to look at it, and often for long periods of time. And as you begin to look at something for long periods of time, your eyes begin to soften. And you begin to see the object in ways that you would have never seen it without placing your undivided attention on it. And it becomes quite alive. It begins to speak energetically as information moving of light and shadow through your eyes. And you begin to notice that it's not so much the object, but the things that you have brought to the object without even noticing, all the filters. And so one of the signatures of a really good artist is being able to move past the filters of the self and get to the pure objectivity. And some might say of the object, and some may say that's impossible. You can't really ever do that. You're always projecting or coloring what you see in the world. But I mention all of this because it brings up the idea that we see the world not as it is, but as we are. And the powerful thing about being an artist or a meditator is you begin to notice what you're bringing, the coloring that you bring to situations, people, and the world. And you begin to see your own unique perspective that was crafted perhaps without you even knowing it. It was part of the way that you were trying to make sense of the world, in a world that doesn't necessarily or rarely make sense. So this brings me back to what I was talking about in the Sat-chit-ananda, that middle part, the chit, the mind resting in the heart, as a collaboration. And this collaboration, like the mind and the heart aren't separate. That's something that we have created with our minds. They're actually very connected. It's just that the mind doesn't always know that in our Western thought-centered world. And so it's like a reconciliation of the mind and the heart, realizing that they're in collaboration and they always have been. And that once this nature is revealed to the mind, then it no longer has to fight itself or battle against parts of the physiology of being, in, for lack of putting it in a better way. And this collaboration, or this realization of this vital collaboration, to where you begin to actually work with it, is what the non-dualist or the Vedantist refers to as Hridaya. And Hridaya refers to this, well, it's translated as secret chamber of the heart. But the quality of the secret chamber of the heart is this quivering of the vulnerable heart, known as spanda. So it's this shaking or this vibration of the open heart that makes available a certain aspect of consciousness that wasn't available before. It's all inclusive. Like when you go to the resorts and they include, all your meals and all your drinks and your airport fare and your taxi or your driver from the airport to the hotel, includes everything. There's nothing left out. And this level of consciousness is vibrant. It's aliveness itself, unfiltered through the mind. It's shining. It's the light, the shining of the light of life itself in us and through us. And this is also the place where the wounding has happened. This is the place where the split between the mind and the heart happened, that we are in the process of recovering from, or actually, I think a better word would be uncovering. We're uncovering it. And what has it been covered with, other than the need to protect, the need to survive, the need to bypass the depth of the disconnect of the mind from the heart, of those around us, of our connection to creation, of our connection to nature, to our connection to the depth of our belonging, and that we shut ourselves down, meaning we were taught away from our authentic nature. We were raised in a world where we were taught miracles were rare, and that trusting your gut or using your intuition is just too risky of an option. You have to think it out, you have to prioritize. And this is why, right, joy, so many people have been disconnected from the joy of just being. And so part of the somatic work that I'm doing is asking, it's founded in the question, how can we return to our most natural state? And this is a process of discovering that we have unknowingly, like if I walked up to that person on the street and said, you know, you don't know your true nature, and they would argue, or they would say, of course I know my nature, I know who I am. Because the layer or the veil of disconnect is so complete that as we begin to discover that we've been unknowingly, like our mind has been protecting us from our own suffering or the level of our suffering. And it's a case of mistaken identity, which translates to the way in our Western culture we have learned to identify our own biofield, our energetic bodies, to a certain orientation of the world and a sense of self that is limited to certain, I want to say, more upper layers, but they're not actually layers. I'm just using this model to help illustrate. It's not like we are like a cake or like a 7-layer dip. That's not the case. But it's very hard to translate these concepts without using some sort of model or some sort of distinction in language. So for lack of a better model, I'm using like the upper layers of awareness. And I mean the upper layers of awareness because these are the things that we're most aware of, conscious of. They're on the surface of our being. They're accessible, more easily accessible. And even this statement, as I mentioned, is misleading to some degree because it implies that any of us, right, we're actually taught about our own life force energy because just isn't true. Unless we've taken an effort to educate ourselves in a particular discipline like karate or taekwondo or meditation or something that actually requires tuning into our own life force and using it intentionally. And even if we have done one of those disciplines and what it requires us to do, it doesn't mean that we've actually accessed that vibrational quality of the mind and the heart coming together in collaboration. So, for example, we just had the Olympics in Paris, and many of the athletes, for example, they have changed their bodies to perform these amazing feats. But this does not actually ensure that the individual whose body has been trained to do these incredible physical feats has any greater knowledge or understanding of their own consciousness or how it functions. So, to kind of wrap things up today in this episode, I just want to say that there's something arising for me in my work that I'm wanting to share around these topics. And it's like the tools and the practices, mainly through the somatic awareness work that I've been doing, the somatic sensing, and what becomes available when we begin to reorientate ourselves around the intelligence that's moving through our bodies all of the time, without getting lost into the mental automated interpreter that already has the idea that it knows. Right? So when people come to me for coaching and they already say, well, I already know that. That's kind of like a big red flag to me, because I figure the way it is if they knew it, then they probably would be, if they already knew, already know that, then they would probably already be changing their behavior or acting in ways that were more in alignment with what they say that they want. And so what is covering up? What is getting in between that person's life and their heart? Where is the disconnect happening? And as long as we sit in, I already know that, then we're missing the point, because clearly there's a different type of knowing that is missing in order to receive the level of like shifting the conditions. And we're not doing it to shift the conditions. We're doing it so we can experience the full joy of just being, without an agenda, without a strategy, without trying to get anywhere, without trying to fix ourselves or fix the world or fix anybody else, because there's nothing wrong. It's almost like being able to surrender into that this strategies of the mind are actually unable and incapable of getting us to this next level of human evolution on an individual level and a collective level. So that's what this work is about in one way. In another way, it's a work of liberation. And just to give a little bit more context around this, it's like, for example, I live in the United States. I was born here. I was raised in this belief system that, the people in America had the right to liberty and justice and freedom for all. But if you look around at the conditions in this country right now, or for the world for that matter, how many people are actually experiencing authentic freedom? And I'm not just talking about economic freedom, political freedom, religious freedom. Yes, all of that. But that's more of an expression of what happens when people actually physically, emotionally, spiritually tune in to that vibration and that frequency of being fully alive and the joy of that. Because once you seep yourself in that, once you begin to open yourself up to that possibility, you begin to see that there is no actual freedom for myself or for yourself if other people aren't experiencing that, because it's a collective field. And so this idea of giving ourselves the permission to flourish, the permission to be in the joy, or to experience the joy of just being, without having to accomplish something, without having to justify being joyful, without, having to get a diploma, a degree, acknowledgement, make a lot of money. That there is something inherently joyful when you see a child at play. And it doesn't matter what toys they're playing with for the most part. They are just having a joy of experiencing life unfolding in front of them. And before the judgment has come in, am I playing okay? Am I playing all right? Are people watching me play? Am I having enough fun? Do I deserve to have fun? All of these conversations that begin to enter into the psyche and begin to repress that life force and separate the heart from the mind as a socialization process. And so I'm in the process of putting together a workshop called Permission to Flourish. And it's all about looking at that juncture point where the breakdown happens, where the mind comes in and starts dividing itself from the emotion, the energy in motion. And it's based on the willingness to experience a deeper response to life, to drop deeper into the life force energy, to let go of the thinking mind. It's still on the surface along with the emotions. And I say that because the thoughts and the emotions are very connected in the personality. And it's like the thoughts and the emotions become part of a closing of life force energy. And more specifically, it's when there's a trigger, when like something happens in our life, some condition or some event happens and we have a trigger. The pain of that trigger is happening on those superficial levels because it's a programmability of a personality. And it's almost like that reaction is a way of protecting us from the original hurt. It's the place where we pull up short because we don't want to feel that pain. But the trigger actually is that echo of a past pain. And it's almost like, it almost acts as like a numbing balm of the personality to where we never even go below that. Just as in meditation, a meditator often begins to notice, oh, my mind is got a whole life of its own. I don't even have to tell it what to think or what to say. It automatically chatters away because it's been programmed with a data stream of the worldview of the people around me that I inherited it from. It's not actually even personal to me. I just inherited it. And then I called it my personality. And it is personal in a way because I took that information and I put my spin on it, right? So it's not total, I mean, there is a level of uniqueness. At least I have that, right? And that's part of the justification that keeps it in place. So the personality takes this form of this strategy, an attempt to control or change or withdraw from something. And so it's a kind of a bypass. These triggers, emotional responses are kind of at one level an emotional bypass from what's really going on in the psyche below that, deeper and the deeper levels of our somatic experience that the mind was created to protect us from, actually. And a lot of it is that unfelt experience that seemed too much for the physiology of our small little bodies as we were growing up. And unfortunately, as I've mentioned time and time again, few of us have ever had the tools given to us because our caregivers did not have the tools available. And so this idea about permission to flourish is to go into these more primal physiological responses that never got witnessed, that never got experienced, that there was never space for. And that's kind of why I call my coaching company Mind Heart Space. It is a shout out to the Sat-chit-ananda, the chit part. The self-knowing, which goes beyond the mind. It includes all layers of our being, including our physiological responses and the wisdom there that the mind couldn't necessarily mix with because it speaks at a different vibration. And so it's like bringing the mental vibration into bringing in an interpreter to start speaking to the energetical level of the body. So it's bringing the primal language of energy that the body speaks in with the higher frequency of the mind, and creating a collaboration or a reconciliation between these two aspects of ourselves, which were split at some time in our life. The mind thinking it was going to get somewhere without the heart, never realizing that it can never get away from the heart. It can create roadblocks, it can create self-sabotage, it can create tower moments in our lives, because energy wants to be directed. And when we have this unconscious energy that's unfelt, unseen, unrecognized, it's like chaotic, dark energy that will not, it's like, reminds me of Frankenstein, right? It's the monster that will not be cast out. He will not be exiled. He will take you with him. And so we have a choice point right now. Are we going to be taken and destroyed by our own creation of the personality or of the mind because of its stubbornness and its unwillingness to acknowledge its origin story, its physiological nature, and that it actually only exists because of the physical experience, their survival process, the vulnerability that's included in our humanity. And so it's August right now, so I'm in the process of putting together this workshop. I haven't decided. I think I'm going to be doing it in person. So if you're local to Portland, I'd love for you to come and experience this with me. It's going to be, I don't know, maybe 2 or 3 days of doing this work together, of giving ourselves permission to flourish all of those areas in our life that we had to pinch off, we had to close down. And I like to think of each person's life as a tree or a plant, because we are organic beings. Our bodies are made of earth, and with the right conditions we can flourish. But if we've been covered over with cement, or we've been forced to live in a box, it's going to actually affect our root system, our ability to root down into the earth, to feel firmly planted. If we don't have access to the sun of source, infinite intelligence, it's going to affect our ability to grow to the heavens and to bloom into the fullness of who we are. If we don't have access to the waters of life at the depth in which our roots need in order to feel nourished and fed, then we will only be half of the plant, half of the human. We will have unaccessed potential. And that is the grief, the deep grief, the sadness that plagues many people and keeps them out of the joy of their own being. And so this workshop, Permission to Flourish, isn't about getting anywhere. It's more like uncovering uncovering where we're at and looking at ways that we can feed ourselves and create a climate that we thrive in. So I think I'll leave it there for today. If any of this catches your ear or your interest, I'd love to hear from you. And I'll let you know as it's percolating and growing where it's going to be at and the exact dates. So if you heard something here today that was of interest to you, please don't forget to leave a comment or like or follow this podcast depending on the platform in which you hear it. It makes a big difference in building the listenership, which allows me to continue to do this work that I love and get information out to people who are looking to make that quantum leap into a fuller, more expansive way of living that is centered and planted in the joy of being. All right, until next time, please remember what a valuable treasure you are, and bye for now.